I just want to set the stage, and I'm going to split this intro into 3 parts. I want to talk a little bit about the qualities of protocols, what is IPFS very briefly, and really the theme of today, which is what you can do with IPFS. And so the qualities of protocols. I think protocols should mostly stay out of the way of users and developers for a good experience. And so informally, we measure this as user experience for users and developer experience for developers. And both users and developers, we're just trying to get things done in this world, right? And so, I mean, I think the best anecdote I can give is, my parents, they probably don't even know what HTTP is, but they certainly call me up complaining about Bluetooth not working. And so, as I mentioned, right, you can use HTTP without really knowing it. Most people use HTTP without realizing it. And I mean, as developers, you can just choose HTTP without really thinking, is it using TCP under the hood, UDP, as is the case now with HTTP 3 and QUIC. And so this is really like the power of abstractions when they're not leaky and when they do a good job. And so good abstractions really make our life easier. And arguably, as I mentioned before, most application developers don't really want to think about protocols, they just want to use them. And so some qualities to these great protocols and standards, and they're underrated when they work well. So RSS, I think created initially by Aaron Schwartz, rest in peace, is a really, really great format. It's the reason why we can have all of our podcasts on any different app, right? So you can use Spotify, Apple, Google, Overcast, and the many more that I have there in the right-hand side. Same thing for Git. There's so many different Git clients. I think I could find 33 clients for Git on the Git SCM website. And BitTorrent, again, multi-client story, one standard, multiple clients. IPFS, I put a question mark there because I think historically that hasn't necessarily been the case, but we're slowly getting there. We're seeing more implementations that are accounting for more platforms, more languages, and more use cases. And so some of you may have attended the implementations track yesterday, and you may have seen IPFS Embed, which is written in Rust, and it's really intended for these low-powered devices. And so I think another good, this sort of kind of leads me to SQL. I've been a long time kind of like full stack developer, so to say. I mean, back in the day it was a webmaster, and then it became a web developer, and now it's a full stack developer. But almost throughout my career, I was using SQL. I first learned SQL when I was about 15, and I did an internship at Vodafone in Australia. And I was working on their billing system, and that's when I first got the chance to work with Oracle. And SQL is now 50 years old. The first paper was introducing sort of SQL as a structured query language was in 1974. And so some of the qualities of great standards and protocols is they stand a test of time, and I think this is really nicely captured by the Lindy effect. Anyone here familiar with the Lindy effect? It's used a lot in the context of Bitcoin. But sort of the Lindy effect is an idea that was popularized by Nassim Taleb. And it teaches us that non-perishable things like technology and ideas age in reverse. So that means that things that have survived for longer will probably live longer in the future too. And so they always say this about Bitcoin. It's been around for, 13 years now. And so, it's standing the test of time, and it's likely to stand the test of time also in the future. And I mean, SQL, it's pretty obvious now that it's 50 years old. And so, some of the other properties of something like SQL even is that it's extremely powerful, it's concise, it's interoperable, and it's abstractable. And for that reason, if you're working with relational databases in SQL, you have so many different options when it comes to abstractions. You can use raw SQL, or you can use ORMs, and you can use query builders, and so you have this whole range of tooling that you can build on top of this standard. Now, it's hard to not address the elephant in the room. I think a lot of us here at IPFS Camp, we came here because we're interested in decentralization and some of the tensions between centralization and decentralization. And I think it's probably worth saying that it's probably a false dichotomy to say it's either decentralized or centralized. Most of us familiar with the OSI model or the TCP/IP model realize that centralization is a spectrum, and you can make judgments about things on different layers of the stack. And so it's never black and white, and it really depends on which layer. But I think what we've seen in the last sort of 10 to 15 years with like social media and the big clouds sort of rising, you have these giants, and these giants, they're driven by quarterly earning reports and efficiency. And on the user side, we care about convenience. We want to just have that lean back experience. So if many of us were pirating stuff back in the 90s and the early 2000s on BitTorrent, these days we just get a bunch of Netflix, Hulu subscriptions, and we like that lean back experience. And so I think that has been the forcing function for a lot of that centralization that we've seen. But obviously there's also the counterforce, and that's a lot of the people who are here today. And so there's many, I don't need to reiterate the benefits of decentralization. I'm sure we're all kind of on board with that. But some of them I think that are worth reiterating are resilience, trustlessness, and verifiability. And this is also a theme in the IPFS world. We have these HTTP gateways, and everyone thinks, okay, I have a SID, I just grab it from a gateway. But are you verifying? Are you doing verified retrieval, or are you just trusting the gateway? I think most cases, people who are using gateways aren't doing verified retrieval, and I think that's also for historical reasons, because we didn't have verified responses. We didn't have the ability to get raw blocks up until recently as part of the gateway standard. And so now it's specified, and now we have this ability. And so that's a sort of like stressing the reality of IPFS as an evolving protocol. And so this leads me to the second part. Okay, what is IPFS? And I'd love to ask you, what do you think IPFS is in 2 to 3 words? Feel free to shout out.
A company. Distributed file system. A shared file system. Content addressing. libgdp. An ecosystem.
Great. I think there's many different varying definitions. It's interesting to me always that it's a distributed file system comes up, because, I don't know, file system is in the name, IPFS, but to me it was always a way to move around bytes rather than actually being a file system. So obviously it is a file system, and UnixFS was sort of the first use case of IPFS, but I think that kind of leads to a lot of confusion amongst people coming to IPFS, because they're like, well, where are my files? I added them, Are they going to be on the network? And it's like, well, the network is mostly responsible with moving the files around. And so there's sort of different varying definitions, and there's a lot of discussions by the implementer working group, like the group working on the different implementations of IPFS. And this is really important because, it's all about interoperability. So I think a lot of the things were said, but in my eyes, the way that I view IPFS is that it's built on 2 core pillars. The first one is content addressing, and the second one is peer-to-peer networking. And the best analogy that I could come up with last night for content addressing is like IKEA article numbers. You see, it doesn't matter which country you go to or which specific IKEA shop you go to, the article number is going to be the same, right? So you can always get the IKEA Kira still anywhere in the world, right? Sure, you don't have to go to a DHT, but just replace DHT with the IKEA database. There's also this notion of breaking away from the client-server model, and I think when we're breaking away from the server-client model, we're moving into this kind of like distributed peer-to-peer web. And the best analogy that I could come up for that is that, well, in a client-server model, you have very sort of specific roles that every network participant takes. You're either a client or a server, obviously. And I think a similar sort of shift happened in like the hotel industry, where you used to have tourists and hotels or hotel chains, and now we have Airbnb, and you have one Airbnb account, you have one sort of identity on Airbnb, and that allows you to be both a host or a guest, depending on whether you're hosting or you're traveling. So we're seeing that with IPFS too, and of course some of you may be familiar with The Cathedral and the Bazaar. It's a great book which really describes the kind of like chaotic, bizarre nature of open source and some of the inherent tensions that we're also seeing play out in the IPFS world between top-down and bottom-up innovation. And so in this book, one of the attributes Eric describes in great open source is that any tool should be useful in the expected way, but a truly great tool lends itself to uses that you never expected. And I think it's probably evident already at this point at IPFS Camp that there's a lot of weird, quirky use cases for IPFS. And I think that's what makes it so exciting. If we take, again, the two core pillars, content addressing and peer-to-peer networking, the possibilities of, things that you can do with just these two concepts are really kind of like endless. And so this will be a theme throughout the day, this top-down, this tension between top-down and bottom-up innovation. This is about pragmatism. This is about what you can do in the real world, right? And a lot of that is bottom-up innovation. And of course, we have some of the great engineers in the other spaces who are doing, thinking about things from first principles. They're, they love purity of ideas. They love great abstractions. But, sometimes, they live in the cathedrals. We're in the bazaar. We got to meet somewhere, and I think this is where we meet. So again, as I said, this is about what you can do with IPFS. Building apps and solving problems for people in the real world. I mean, ultimately, this is my opinion, but I think technology is about liberating people. And I hope that this will be sort of one of the guiding principles for us. So this track is structured in the spirit of two trends, reinvention and preservation. On one hand, celebrating the innovation in developer tooling in this space, showcasing the power of modern approaches to decentralized software. And some of the examples include DIDs, UCANs, user-controlled keys, self-custody, social recovery, even local-first software, user-owned data, crypt trees, B trees, poly trees, and of course, CRDTs. I think we're all very excited about CRDTs. And then on the other hand, preserving the established wisdom of community-driven open source software, open, ubiquitous, and interoperable standards like IPFS and HTTP, and radical incrementalism as part of a shared vision for a better internet. So in summary, this track is about the overlap between developers, users, and decentralization.